Aaron Hernandez walked out of a Boston courtroom a free man in one case, and 5 days later he was dead in a prison cell. In between was one of the strangest endings in NFL history. Stay with me, because what happened during those 5 days may explain how a man who had just won a legal victory ended up dead. On April 14, 2017, a Boston jury delivered a verdict nobody outside the courtroom fully expected. Jurors in Boston reached the verdict after 6 days of deliberations, acquitting Hernandez of first-degree murder, armed assault with intent to murder, assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, and witness intimidation, but convicting him of unlawful possession of a gun. The only thing they hung him with was a gun charge, and Hernandez was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in 2015. Though he had appealed for a new trial in that case, a separate conviction that this new verdict had zero effect on. The charges he just beat were serious. He faced 8 counts in all, including 2 of murder and 3 of armed assault. He was accused of gunning down 2 men, Daniel Abreu and Safiro Furtado, in a drive-by outside a Boston nightclub back in July 2012. Prosecutors said the motive was almost laughably small. Prosecutors argued that Hernandez killed Abreu and Furtado because he felt disrespected when one of them bumped him and spilled his drink. The prosecution's whole case leaned on one man, Alexander Bradley, a former associate of Hernandez's. The case hinged on the credibility of Bradley, who alleged Hernandez confessed to the 2012 murders and later attempted to silence him by shooting him in the face in 2013. Because he feared Bradley might tip off law enforcement about the double murders. The defense went after Bradley hard. The defense painted Bradley as a revenge-seeking criminal with a motive to lie. It worked. Hernandez was also acquitted of shooting Bradley in the face months later to try to silence him as a witness. When the verdict came down, the room reacted the way you'd expect from a case with this much weight behind it. The former tight end for the New England Patriots wept quietly as the verdicts were read in Boston. A few moments later, he looked back at his fiancée and nodded somberly as relatives of the victims sobbed loudly. A defense attorney hugged him. His lead attorney called the outcome a relief. His defense attorney said he was delighted and that Hernandez was relieved about the verdict, adding, "He was charged for something somebody else did, and that is a weighty burden for anyone to shoulder." On the other side of the room, there was nothing but devastation. The families of Furtado and De Abreu, who broke down in tears during the verdict, were devastated, according to Suffolk County District Attorney Dan Conley. The DA tried to find something to hold on to. Conley said he and the families took solace, knowing that Hernandez would not be walking free. Because no matter what happened in this trial, he still had that life sentence for Odin Lloyd waiting for him back in his cell. That's the strange piece of this whole story. Hernandez didn't walk out of that courtroom a free man in any real sense. Hernandez, once a rising star in the NFL, was already serving a life sentence in prison for killing the boyfriend of his fiancee's sister. That first-degree murder conviction had been handed down by unanimous jury decision in 2015. All this acquittal did was strip away one more murder charge, one more life sentence stacked on top of the one he already had. He was still going back to the same prison, the same cell, the same fate. But by every account from people around him in the days that followed, something about beating that second case seemed to lift something in him, right before it all came crashing down. 5 days later, guards found him in his cell at the Souza Baranowski Correctional Center. Hernandez, who was 27 and serving a life sentence in prison for murder, was found dead in his prison cell shortly after 3 a.m., and the death was ruled a suicide. He'd hanged himself after jamming cardboard into the tracks of his cell door to impede entry. The timing landed like a gut punch across the sports world, because it wasn't just any week. It was Super Bowl parade week for his old team. Hernandez committed suicide just hours before his former teammates visited the White House to celebrate their latest Super Bowl victory, and a week after he was acquitted in the 2012 drive-by shootings of 2 men in Boston. So that's the shape of it. A man wins the biggest legal victory of his life, and less than a week later, he's dead by his own hand, in the same prison where he still had decades ahead of him. To understand why, you have to go back much further than that courtroom. Back to how a kid from Connecticut became one of the most talked about players in football, and how that same career put him on a path toward 2 dead bodies, a murder trial, and eventually a cell at Souza Baranowski. Before any of the trials, before any of the headlines, Aaron Hernandez was one of the most talented tight ends to come out of college football in years. Aaron Hernandez, born in Bristol, Connecticut, was a rising star tight end and member of the New England Patriots before his 2013 arrest. He played college ball at the University of Florida and was drafted into the NFL at only 20 years old. He'd been part of a championship program too, a star for the University of Florida when it won the 2008 title. Hernandez dropped to the 4th round of the NFL draft because of trouble in college that included a failed drug test and a bar fight. His name had already brushed up against something darker even before the NFL. His name had also come up in an investigation into a shooting. None of that stopped New England from taking a swing on him. In Foxborough, he became part of one of the most feared tight end tandems the league had ever seen. In 3 seasons with the Patriots, Hernandez joined Rob Gronkowski to form one of the most potent tight end duos in NFL history. He caught passes from Tom Brady, played on the game's biggest stage, and the Patriots rewarded him for it. Roughly 6 weeks after 2 men were gunned down outside a Boston club in the summer of 2012, a case that would later be tied directly to him, the team doubled down on its investment. About 6 weeks after Furtado and Abreu were killed, Hernandez signed a 5-year, $40 million contract with the Patriots and went on to play another season before Lloyd was killed. That's worth sitting with for a second. The contract that made him rich came after the double murder he'd eventually stand trial for, while the case sat unsolved and Hernandez kept playing football like nothing had happened. The case remained unsolved, and later that summer, Hernandez signed a massive new contract with the Patriots. But behind the scenes, things weren't holding together. His personal life continued to unravel. Then came June 2013. On June 17, 2013, the body of semi-pro football player Odin Lloyd was found in an industrial park a mile from Hernandez's mansion in North Attleboro, Massachusetts. Lloyd wasn't a stranger. Lloyd was dating Shania Jenkins, the sister of Hernandez's fiancée, Shayana Jenkins. Investigators moved fast, and Hernandez didn't make it easy on himself. Police quickly traced evidence back to Hernandez, though the NFL star complicated matters by destroying his cell phone and surveillance footage from his home. Within days, his career was over. On June 26, Hernandez was led from his home in handcuffs and charged with first-degree murder and 5 firearms violations. The Patriots announced his release less than 2 hours after his arrest, and Hernandez was soon dropped by corporate sponsors. The man who just signed a $40 million deal was suddenly persona non grata across the entire league in less time than it takes to play a single quarter of football. The investigation into Lloyd's death didn't stay isolated for long either. Detectives working the case started noticing connections to the older, unsolved Boston shooting. Authorities believe the June murder of Odin Lloyd in North Attleboro is connected to a double murder in Boston that took place in July of 2012. A search warrant tied to a vehicle at a relative's house pushed that theory further. Boston officials were alerted to the home by investigators probing the murder of Odin Lloyd after they noticed an unused 4Runner in the garage, and investigators alleged the 4Runner matches the SUV used in the July 2012 double homicide in Boston. By 2014, prosecutors had built enough of a case to formally charge him with both older killings. On May 15, 2014, Hernandez was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the 2012 killings of Abreu and Furtado in Boston. And on May 28, he pleaded not guilty to the double murder charges. That meant Hernandez was now facing trial for 3 murders total, spread across 2 separate cases, with the Lloyd case going first. That trial began in early 2015, and the details that came out painted a picture of a man who'd been unraveling for a while. The arraignment provided details for the motive and evidence, alleging Hernandez had been upset that Lloyd had talked with his enemies during a prior evening out. After weeks of testimony, including an appearance from his own fiancée under a grant of immunity, Jenkins, Hernandez's fiancée, testified as a prosecution witness under immunity. The jury reached its decision. On April 15, 2015, Hernandez was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There's a detail from that stretch that's almost impossible to script better than reality did it. While Hernandez sat in a courtroom fighting for his life, his old team went on to win it all without him. On February 1, 2015, without Hernandez, the Patriots beat the Seattle Seahawks 28-24 to win Super Bowl XLIX. The tight end who once lined up next to Gronkowski wasn't just off the roster. He was a convicted murderer watching his old team celebrate a title from a jail cell. Serving a life sentence for Lloyd's murder should have been the end of the story, legally speaking. But there was still one more trial left, the one tied to those 2012 killings outside the Boston nightclub. That trial is where the story swings back around to the moment we opened on, the acquittal and the 5 days that followed it. By the time Hernandez's second murder trial opened in February 2017, he was already a convicted killer serving life without parole. That fact alone should have made this trial almost an afterthought. Instead, it became the case that would define how his story ended. Hernandez's second trial began in February 2017. Prosecutors leaned hard into the same theory of a man who couldn't let small things go. Prosecutors portrayed Hernandez as impulsive, volatile, and deeply paranoid, someone who responded violently to perceived slights. And they theorized that the murders were an act of retaliation after Abreu accidentally spilled a drink on him at the nightclub earlier that night and failed to apologize. It's a strange thing to hang a double homicide on, a spilled drink, but that was the entire foundation prosecutors built their case around. The physical evidence wasn't nothing either. Despite significant ballistic evidence and vehicle links, the jury acquitted Hernandez on both murder charges on April 14, 2017. That's the part that surprised a lot of legal observers. There were bullets, there was a car connected to the scene, and still the jury came back with not guilty on the murder counts. What made the difference wasn't Hernandez's defense poking holes in ballistics. It was picking apart the credibility of the star witness. Bradley's account was central to everything, and the defense worked to make sure jurors saw him as damaged goods. The case hinged on the credibility of Bradley, who alleged Hernandez confessed to the 2012 murders and later attempted to silence him by shooting him in the face in 2013. And the defense painted Bradley as a revenge-seeking criminal with a motive to lie. Jurors weren't allowed to factor in what they might already know about Hernandez from his other conviction. Jurors who began deliberations last Friday were instructed not to consider Hernandez's prior conviction, and Hernandez did not testify in either trial. After close to a week of deliberation, the jury landed on its verdict. Former New England Patriots player Aaron Hernandez was acquitted of 2 counts of first-degree murder Friday, following 6 days of jury deliberations that lasted more than 40 hours. Out of 8 total charges, only 1 stuck. The former NFL star faced 8 counts in all, including 2 of murder and 3 of armed assault, and Hernandez was found guilty of just 1 count: illegal possession of a firearm. For that, the judge tacked on extra prison time. The jury did find him guilty of illegal possession of a firearm, for which he was sentenced to serve 4 to 5 years in prison. Legal analysts pointed out at the time just how strange this outcome was for Hernandez personally, even if it barely mattered practically. The former NFL tight end was appealing his life sentence in prison for the murder of Odin Lloyd, and this acquittal was 1 step closer to his freedom, even though realistically, the odds on that appeal succeeding were long. There was also a financial and legal ripple effect nobody was thinking about in the moment. A guilty verdict here would have made things much easier for the families pursuing him civilly. A guilty verdict would have improved the Abreu and Furtado families' chances in their wrongful death lawsuits against Hernandez, since those lawsuits require a preponderance of evidence, and a criminal conviction requiring proof beyond a reasonable doubt would have all but ensured the success of the accompanying civil lawsuits. What made this acquittal sting the most for the victims' families wasn't just the loss in court. It was the visible relief on Hernandez's face while they broke down feet away from him. Aaron Hernandez became emotional after the verdict was read, and a visibly emotional Hernandez teared up and embraced his attorneys as the verdict was read. Reporters in the room described the same scene from multiple angles. A man who looked like weight had just been lifted off him, next to families who just watched 2 of their loved ones' killer walk away from murder charges. The former tight end for the New England Patriots wept quietly as the verdicts were read in Boston, and a few moments later, he looked back at his fiancée and nodded somberly as relatives of the victims sobbed loudly. For a man who'd spent years insisting he was innocent and who never took the stand to argue it himself, this was as close to vindication as he was ever going to get. Hernandez did not raise CTE in his defense at either trial because he claimed actual innocence. That detail matters more than it seems on the surface, because it tells you Hernandez wasn't building a defense around brain damage or diminished capacity. He was arguing to the very end that he simply didn't do it. And there was one more piece of evidence that came out of this trial that reporters would circle back to almost immediately after his death. Something prosecutors used to paint him as cold rather than remorseful. Prosecutors had argued that Hernandez gunned the 2 men down after one accidentally spilled a drink on him in a nightclub, and then got a tattoo of a handgun and the words "God forgives" to commemorate the crime. Whatever the jury made of the ballistics and the witness testimony, that detail lingered. A man who marked his own body with a reference to forgiveness for a crime he was ultimately acquitted of committing. By the time the courtroom emptied out that Friday, Hernandez had a piece of good news to carry back to his cell for the first time in years. He wasn't free. He was never going to be free. But for once, the story wasn't entirely working against him. 5 days later, all of that would stop mattering. The days between the acquittal and Hernandez's death looked, from the outside, almost ordinary. Inmates who spoke with investigators afterward described someone who seemed to be planning ahead, not winding down. In one of the reports, a source claiming to be Hernandez's close friend in prison said after he was acquitted of the double murder, he had been talking about the NFL and going back to play even if it wasn't with the Pats. That's not the language of a man plotting his own death. It's someone talking about a future. Other details from inside the prison told a similar story, right up until they didn't. One inmate said Hernandez requested his laundry be ready for the weekend because he was expecting a visit from his fiancée and daughter. But there were stranger comments mixed in too, the kind that only make sense in hindsight. One inmate told investigators Hernandez told him the night before he died, "When you die, your soul gets reincarnated." Another detail investigators pulled from interviews pointed to something almost calculated. Another inmate told investigators Hernandez mentioned that if you die in prison and have an open appeal, your case gets thrown out. That's not a throwaway comment. It's a legal fact Hernandez apparently understood, and it lines up almost exactly with what happened to his conviction after his death. On the night itself, Hernandez was on the phone with the woman who'd stood by him through both trials. Hernandez's lawyer, Ronald Sullivan, told the Globe that the 27-year-old was on the telephone with his longtime fiancée and mother of his 4-year-old daughter, Shayana Jenkins Hernandez, about 7 hours before he was found in his cell. Hours later, guards found him. According to the Massachusetts Department of Correction, Hernandez was in a single cell in a general population housing, and a spokesman told ABC News that there was no prior concern that Hernandez was suicidal, and that if there had been, he would have been on mental health watch in a different part of the prison. Medical staff couldn't bring him back. He never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead just after 4 a.m. ET. And after performing an autopsy, Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Henry N. Niels concluded the cause of death as asphyxia by hanging, and the manner of death was suicide. What investigators found inside that cell is what turned this from a tragic footnote into something people are still talking about years later. A report released by state police said John 3:16 was written on Hernandez's forehead and on the cell wall. Next to him was a Bible open to that exact passage. The notes were found next to a Bible open to John 3:16. The lines reading, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." Alongside the Bible, investigators found 3 separate letters, each one addressed to somebody different. 3 handwritten notes were found next to a Bible in Hernandez's cell, addressed to his fiancée, his daughter, and a close prison friend. The letter to his attorney read like someone processing a win, not planning an ending. Hernandez referenced the couple's song, Savage Garden's "I Knew I Loved You," and mentioned contacting music artists like Meek Mill and Jay-Z, who'd helped him through his tough times, writing that he'd penned the letter following his acquittal to voice how he felt. His attorney said flatly there was nothing in it suggesting what was coming. Baez said that Hernandez's note addressed to him showed no indication the former NFL star was contemplating suicide. The letters to his fiancée and daughter read very differently. To Shayana, he wrote about being soulmates and about having told her, in his words, what was coming without ever saying it outright. "Shay, you have always been my soulmate, and I want you to live life and know I'm always with you," he writes in the note. "I told you what was coming indirectly. I love you so much and know you are an angel." He asked her to tell his story in full and to hold on to how much he loved her rather than anything else. "Tell my story fully, but never think anything besides how much I love you." The letter to his daughter, not yet 5 years old at the time, was even stranger, filled with references to reincarnation and a kind of eternal presence. "Daddy will never leave you. I'm entering to the timeless realm in which I can enter into any form at any time. Because everything that could happen or not happened, I see all at once. Life is eternal. Believe." His family's reaction once the news broke was disbelief. The family and legal team is shocked and surprised at the news of Aaron's death. Baez said in a statement, There were no conversations or correspondence from Aaron to his family or legal team that would have indicated anything like this was possible. Toxicology results ruled out one theory quickly. The state police report said toxicology tests showed Hernandez's blood came back negative for all substances tested, including synthetic marijuana. So there it is, a man who'd just beaten a murder case, who was reportedly talking about a future in football, calling music artists who'd helped him through hard times on the phone with his fiancée hours before, and yet leaving behind letters that read like goodbyes, months in the making. The people closest to him swore they saw nothing coming, and yet what came next in a lab in Boston gave everyone a reason to look back at years of his behavior in a completely different light. 7 months after Hernandez's death, researchers at Boston University released findings that reframed the entire story. His family had made the decision early, in the chaos right after his death, to send his brain for study. Hernandez family attorney Jose Baez said the family plans to donate the brain to advance the study of CTE, which is a degenerative brain disease that has been linked to athletes, including football players, who might suffer concussions and head trauma. That release only happened once the manner of death had been legally settled. Although Hernandez's body was released shortly after his death, officials withheld some of his tissues, including his brain, until the cause of his death could be determined. Once that investigation was completed, the brain was released to Boston University's Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Center, per his family's wishes. What researchers found stunned even people who study this disease for a living. A study of Aaron Hernandez's brain showed he had stage 3 CTE when he killed himself in April. Researchers said, stage 3 out of 4 is already severe, but the real shock was his age. Hernandez, just 27 when he hanged himself with a bedsheet, was riddled with stage 3 CTE to a degree that we've never seen in our 468 brains, except for individuals very much older. Ann McKee, director of BU's Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy Center, told a news conference, adding, individuals with similar gross findings were at least 46 years old at the time of death. Hernandez's own attorney summed up how extreme the finding was. We're told it was the most severe case they had ever seen for someone of Aaron's age, attorney Jose Baez said. McKee pointed specifically to the frontal lobes, the part of the brain tied to judgment and impulse control, as visibly damaged. Especially in the frontal lobes, which are very important for decision-making, judgment, and cognition, we could see damage to the inner chambers of the brain, McKee said as she screened slides showing sections of Hernandez's brain. Baez, looking back, described a pattern of behavior that fit what researchers were now describing. Baez said Hernandez had shown signs of memory loss, impulsivity, and aggression that could be attributed to CTE, adding, when hindsight is 20/20, you look back and there are things you might have noticed, but you don't know. McKee was careful not to draw a straight line from the disease to his crimes, but she didn't dismiss a connection either. McKee said it's impossible to know precisely how the CTE impacted him, as many factors likely contributed to his behavior and actions, adding that CTE likely contributed to his depression and his erratic, impulsive, violent behaviors. CTE isn't unique to Hernandez, and that's part of what makes his case land the way it does. By that point, the BU Center had identified CTE in nearly 100 former football players, and researchers said the condition can cause symptoms such as memory loss, impaired judgment, impulse control problems, aggression, depression, anxiety, and suicidality. Other names had come before his several other former NFL players who committed suicide, including Adrian Robinson, Dave Duerson, and Junior Seau, were later found to have CTE. Medical researchers point to a real, documented risk tied to the disease. Research shows that people with CTE may be at increased risk of suicide, according to Mayo Clinic. The diagnosis didn't just change how people talked about Hernandez, it changed the legal landscape around his case entirely. Days after his death, before the CTE findings were even public, his lawyers moved to have his Odin Lloyd conviction thrown out entirely, using a legal doctrine most people had never heard of. This abatement had nothing to do with new evidence, but with a law recognized in Massachusetts dealing with the appeals process. Abatement ab initio, meaning that if a defendant dies before their appeal can be heard, then their conviction can be thrown out. A judge granted it. On May 9, 2017, CNN reported that Judge Susan Garsh vacated Hernandez's murder conviction. For a while, that meant Hernandez was, on paper, no longer a convicted murderer. Legally, yes, his conviction was vacated, and he was considered innocent at the time of his death. Prosecutors pushed back hard and pointed out exactly why that felt wrong to so many people. Prosecutors argued that dismissing Hernandez's murder conviction would reward his decision to take his own life. They fought it all the way up. In September 2017, prosecutors in Bristol County asked for Hernandez's guilty verdict to be reinstated. But the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ruled that October that the conviction would not be reinstated at that time. That wasn't the final word, though. Nearly 2 years later, the state's highest court reversed course entirely. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court reversed that ruling on March 13, 2019, abolishing abatement ab initio in the state, calling the doctrine outdated, and reinstating the first-degree murder conviction. The conviction stands. Whatever brief legal window his death had opened, it closed for good. Odin Lloyd's killer, in the eyes of the law, was a murderer again. The CTE diagnosis outlived the legal back and forth in a different way. It became the foundation of a lawsuit, filed on behalf of the one person Hernandez left all those letters for. His daughter sought to hold the NFL and helmet maker Riddell responsible for the brain damage her father sustained, which she argued ultimately ended his life and robbed her of a relationship with him. His attorney framed it as a matter of accountability for the sport itself. There's no question that the CTE is a result of playing football, Baez said. They need to be held accountable. We are filing a lawsuit against the NFL and the New England Patriots. So that's where the story lands. A man wins the case that mattered least to his sentence and loses the fight that mattered most. 5 days later, in a cell nobody thought he'd be leaving that way. What came out afterward? The brain scans, the legal reversals, the lawsuit filed in a 4-year-old's name didn't undo any of it. It just gave everyone left behind a set of reasons to point to for a decision that, in the end, nobody who loved him saw coming.